Have you ever noticed that millennials and Gen Z often see the world in completely different ways, even though they grew up only a few years apart? They use the same apps, watch the same content, and live in the same digital world. But when it comes to work, relationships, identity, success, and even happiness, their mindsets can feel surprisingly different. Millennials are often described as ambitious but exhausted. Gen Z is often seen as emotionally aware but skeptical of traditional systems. One generation was told to chase stability at all costs. The other grew up questioning whether stability even exists anymore. So why do they think so differently? The answer has a lot to do with timing. Millennials grew up during the rise of the internet. They remember a world before smartphones and social media completely took over daily life. Technology was exciting and full of possibility. The message they received was optimistic: work hard, get educated, build a career, and success will follow. Many millennials believed in that system because at the time, it still seemed realistic. Gen Z, however, entered a very different world. They didn't slowly adapt to technology. They were born into it. Social media, instant communication, and constant information were already normal by the time they were young. Instead of seeing the internet as a tool, they experienced it as part of everyday life. And because of this, Gen Z developed a very different relationship with reality. Millennials experience the internet as something separate from life. Gen Z experiences it as part of life itself. This difference affects attention, communication, and even identity. Millennials tend to value consistency and long-term planning because they grew up during a time when those things were strongly encouraged. Many were taught that if they worked hard enough, they could build a stable future. But then, reality changed. Economic crisis, rising living costs, burnout culture, and job instability hit many millennials hard. A lot of them follow the correct path, education, career, hard work, and still ended up overwhelmed or financially stressed. This experience shaped Gen Z's perspective. Gen Z watched millennials burn themselves out trying to achieve stability. So instead of fully trusting traditional ideas of success, they became more skeptical of them. That's one reason Gen Z often prioritizes balance and mental health more openly. They saw what happened when work becomes someone's entire identity. To millennials, hustle culture once looked motivating. To Gen Z, it often looks unhealthy. Another major difference is how the two generations approach identity and self-expression. Millennials grew up in a culture that still pushed certain social expectations strongly: career milestones, traditional success, and fitting into established systems. Gen Z grew up during a time when many of those systems were already being questioned. As a result, Gen Z is generally more open to fluidity, change, and self-exploration. They are less likely to accept "because it's how it's always been" as a valid answer. This can make them appear rebellious or overly sensitive to older generations. But from their perspective, they're simply being more honest about what they feel and want. Another key difference is how each generation handles information. Millennials experienced information as something you search for. Gen Z experiences information as something constantly arriving. This changes how the brain processes attention. Millennials are generally more comfortable with longer attention spans because they grew up with slower media. Gen Z grew up with short-form content, fast-moving platforms, and constant stimulation. This doesn't mean Gen Z is less intelligent. It means their brains adapted to a different speed of information. They process quickly, switch attention rapidly, and often absorb information in shorter bursts. But this constant stimulation also comes with consequences. When you constantly analyze emotions, identity, and social dynamics, life can start to feel emotionally heavy. And that's something Gen Z struggles with more than many people realize. All of this leads to unimportant truth. Millennials and Gen Z aren't different because one generation is right and the other is wrong. They think differently because they were shaped by different realities. And those realities changed fast. One of the biggest differences between millennials and Gen Z shows up in the way they approach work. Millennials were raised during the peak of dream job culture. They were encouraged to find passion, work hard, stay committed, and climb steadily towards success. Productivity became closely tied to self-worth. That's why so many millennials became trapped in hustle culture, working long hours, constantly staying busy, and sacrificing personal time started to feel normal. Success was often seen as something you had to earn through exhaustion. But Gen Z grew up watching the effects of that mindset. Another major difference is how the two generations use social media. Millennials experienced social media as something exciting and social. It was about connecting, sharing moments, and building online communities. Gen Z grew up after social media had already become highly competitive and algorithm-driven. For them, social media is not just communication, it's identity, entertainment, news, trends, comparison, and sometimes even income all combined into one system. There's also a big difference in how both generations handle relationships and communications. Millennials grew up during a time when most communication still happened face-to-face or through slower forms of messaging. Relationships often developed more gradually. Gen Z grew up with instant communication. Messages happen immediately, reactions happen immediately, opinions spread immediately. This creates speed, but it can also create emotional pressure. Another important contrast is optimism versus realism. Millennials, especially when younger, were generally raised with a more optimistic message about the future. Even during struggles, there was still a strong belief that things would eventually improve if you worked hard enough. Gen Z entered adulthood during a time of economic uncertainty, global crisis, rising living costs, and non-stop online exposure to problems around the world. As a result, Gen Z tends to approach the future more cautiously. Some people interpret this as negativity, but psychologically, it's more about adaptation. When uncertainty becomes normal, people naturally become more realistic and emotionally guarded. This also affects humor and communication styles. Millennial humor often focused on awkwardness, optimism, and relatable life struggles. Gen Z humor tends to be faster, more ironic, self-aware, and sometimes intentionally absurd. Why? Because humor reflects emotional coping. Gen Z uses irony and humor to process overstimulation, uncertainty, and emotional fatigue in a world that constantly feels overwhelming. And underneath all these differences, there's one thing both generations actually share: exhaustion. Millennials are exhausted from trying to meet expectations that kept changing. Gen Z is exhausted from growing up in a world where expectations never stop. The difference is how they respond to that exhaustion. Millennials often internalize pressure and keep pushing forward. Gen Z is more likely to question the pressure itself. Neither response is completely right or wrong. They are simply different survival strategies shaped by different environments. And that's the key to understanding generational psychology. Every generation believes its mindset is normal because it reflects the world it grew up in. But when the world changes rapidly, the next generation adapts differently. That's exactly what happened between millennials and Gen Z. One generation learned to trust the system before watching it crack. The other grew up already seeing the cracks. And that single difference changed the way they think about almost everything.